Hi, it's Concita Thomas with Great Shape Fit Club, and we're continuing our discussion on macronutrient management for maximized results. So we talked about already in my last tip to you guys what macronutrients were, basically the groups that foods fall into: carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And we also talked about what each one of them do in your body. What the purpose of carbohydrate in your diet is, what the purpose of protein is, and what the purpose of fat is. So there's a lot of other things that I could possibly discuss next, but I know a lot of you are really eager to get to the part of having some type of understanding of what your macronutrient starting point as far as the distribution or the percentage of each macronutrient should be in your daily diet. So we're going to go ahead and jump into that in today's discussion. So for illustration purposes, I have broken down what your macronutrient ratio should be based on body type and or primary fitness goal. So what I want to say before we start this is there is really no magic number for anyone. All of these things are estimates. They're starting points. You will pick the starting point that's most appropriate for the way your body is built and or what your goal may be, and then you will always track what is going on with your body. It's part of why we have the fast track where you report your results every month. You need to pay attention to how your body is responding to what you're doing, no matter what it is. So with that in mind, I'm talking about today the 3 different somatotypes. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that before, but it's a way to classify body types and the corresponding macronutrient goals. So the first somatotype is an ectomorph, and an ectomorph is typically naturally lean, has very long and thin limbs. Those are also characteristics of an ectomorph body type. So someone who has that type of body, typically the goals may be to increase muscle definition, or for our ladies that may be, I want to have more curves or I want to be a little bit tighter, as well as support high intensity or long duration training. Not that all ectomorphs do that, but they do have a natural tendency to be more active. So the macronutrient ratio for that group is 50-30-20. So with that 50-30-20 split, the first number represents carbohydrates. So 50% of your daily nutrition coming from carbohydrates. And that's not just starches and grains. Fruits and vegetables fall into that category as well. 30% coming from proteins and 20% coming from fat. So what you'll see is that ectomorphs typically have a very high carbohydrate tolerance. They usually do very well eating a lot of carbs without gaining fat. And usually you'll see ectomorphs do well on the lower end of the recommended daily intake of fat, being between 20 up to 40%. So 50-30-20 is the ectomorph breakdown, and that leads us to the next somatotype. The next somatotype is mesomorph, and as you'll see from my little stick figure here, I'm not an artist, guys. The mesomorph typically can be described as someone who has no problem putting on muscle. They're usually very muscular, even maybe from childhood with no weight training. That's just their natural form. And they usually are on the relative lean side. So if you wanted to think of a body type or maybe an athlete that would typically be a mesomorph, you may think of a gymnast and or a sprinter are typical sports that, do well for a mesomorph frame or that type of thing. Or your typical world-class gymnast or sprinter typically has a mesomorph body type. The typical goal for a mesomorph going about a nutrition program is to lose fat while maintaining muscle. And for that goal or that body type, the macronutrient recommended starting point for macronutrient split is 40-30-30. 40% carb, 30% protein, and 30% fat. And as you can see, the difference with an ectomorph and mesomorph is that the recommended starting point is a little bit less carbohydrate, a little bit more fat. When you talk about balanced diet, and I say balanced loosely because what's balanced for one person is out of balance for another. The mesomorph recommended starting point comes most closely to a balanced diet. Almost all of the nutrients are almost equal, really, with carbs being a little bit higher. And then finally for endomorph, the endomorph somatotype or body type classification normally has a hard time getting lean. That would be, that body type has a propensity to carry a higher body weight and a higher body fat percentage, even when physically active. And the typical goal for an endomorph undergoing a nutrition program is to lose body fat. So the recommended starting point for endomorphs is 25, 35, 40, with 25% being carbohydrate, 35% being protein, and 40% being fat. So the endomorph would typically take in about half the amount of carbohydrate as an ectomorph, and still significantly less than a mesomorph, slightly higher protein than both groups, and higher fats than both groups. So some things that I want to point out, because the first thing is determining, well, what body type am I? A lot of times people have no clue, even when given these demonstrations, they're a little bit conflicted about, well, what group do I really fall into? I would say don't worry about that as much. Again, this is, somatotypes really isn't related to like what do I look like now, but it's really like how you were born, what you were naturally. So giving you some clues of what type of somatotype you have may be to actually like look at some childhood photos. Like, were you the long, skinny kid all the time? Or were you always somewhat rounder and maybe, smaller kid? Another clue, regardless of whether or not you're carrying extra body fat right now, where you can still get a clue into what your somatotype may be, is to look at your limbs and the size of them. So ectomorphs normally have really, really, small limbs. Ectomorphs usually have a little bit thicker limbs. That will give you a clue as well. It's also important to note that very few people are strict ecto, meso, or endo. So a lot of people are a cross between two different somatotypes. And it's also important to notice that lifestyle over time can change your body's natural tendency. So you can be an ecto who, through excessive sugar consumption and inactivity over years and years and years, now your body may react more like an endo. You may not have the high carbohydrate tolerance that you had earlier in life. So if you're completely confused with the somatotype thing, the easiest thing to do is to look at your goal to figure out where to start. If your primary goal is to lose fat, lose extra body fat, meaning you maybe have more than 40 pounds to lose, so even muscle definition isn't as big of a concern for you right now, then you would want to start with the endomorph recommendations of 25, 35, 40. If you are relatively lean and you have muscle in your frame, and it's very important to you to keep that muscle definition while you lose fat, then start with the mesomorph recommendations of 40, 30, 30. And then finally, if you are satisfied with your level of leanness and your main goal is to put on a little bit more muscle or to see more muscle definition or just to eat better to support your physical activity, then start with the ectomorph recommendations of 50, 30, 20. So that was installment number 2 or lesson number 2 on macronutrient management. I hope that was enlightening. Let me know what you think about it. Bye-bye.